August 1945. Across Western Europe, from the rubble of German cities to the supply depots of France, from muddy Belgian roads to dusty Italian hillsides, sit hundreds of thousands of American-built trucks. GMC Jimmies queue by the thousands in motor pools stretching for miles. These olive-drab workhorses, sent to defeat Nazi Germany, now face an uncertain future. The guns have fallen silent, but the question of what happens to over 500,000 trucks delivered by General Motors remains unanswered. Military planners must decide whether to ship them home, sell them as surplus, or transfer them to Allied nations rebuilding from the ashes of war. The disposal of these legendary trucks becomes a story of pragmatic necessity, Cold War calculation, and gradual transformation from instruments of war into tools of reconstruction. The scale of GMC truck production between 1941 and 1945 remains staggering. General Motors manufactured approximately 572,500 units of the CCKW and its variants. This included the standard 2.5-ton 6x6 cargo truck, the amphibious DUKW nicknamed the Duck, and the 6x4 on-road CCW model. Of the nearly 2.4 million trucks purchased by the United States Army during the war, some 812,000 were 2.5-ton trucks. GMC's production alone accounted for almost a quarter of total wartime American truck output and 70% of all 2.5-ton trucks manufactured. These numbers made the GMC CCKW second only to the legendary Jeep in total wartime vehicle production. American servicemen called the truck the Jimmy, a phonetic play on the GMC brand name. They also dubbed it the Deuce and a Half, referencing its 2.5-ton cargo capacity. These nicknames would follow the truck for decades after the war ended. The designation CCKW came from GMC's internal coding system. The first C indicated a 1941 design year. The second C meant conventional cab. The K denoted all-wheel drive, and the W signified dual rear axles. But such technical designations meant little to soldiers who depended on these trucks for survival. Production began at General Motors' yellow truck and coach plant in Pontiac, Michigan, in early 1941. As demand intensified following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of that year, manufacturing expanded to Chevrolet's St. Louis, Missouri facility. Early models featured enclosed metal cabs derived from civilian truck designs. By 1943, production shifted to open cab configurations with canvas roofs and doors. This change simplified manufacturing, reduced shipping height for overseas transport, and allowed installation of ring mounts for .50-caliber machine guns above the passenger seat. Approximately 1/4 of all CCKWs received these defensive weapon mounts. Power came from GMC's proven 270, cubic-inch inline 6-cylinder engine producing approximately 104 horsepower. The straightforward design made field repairs possible without specialized tools. Mechanics appreciated the engine's reliability and the accessibility of its components. The 5-speed transmission and 2-speed transfer case provided the flexibility needed for both highway driving and off-road operations. This combination of rugged simplicity and proven engineering would define the truck's reputation for decades. The CCKW earned its legendary status during the liberation of Western Europe, particularly through an operation that became known as the Red Ball Express. Following the Allied breakout from Normandy in August 1944, American infantry and armored units burst onto the open fields of central France. General George Patton's Third Army raced eastward at speeds that outpaced traditional supply methods. Rail lines lay destroyed by Allied bombing. Ports remained either captured or contested. The advancing armies faced a logistics crisis that threatened to halt the entire offensive. American commanders devised a solution worthy of the nation that invented assembly line manufacturing. They created an enormous truck convoy system that would operate around the clock on dedicated routes, marked with red balls, a railroad term meaning priority express shipment. Beginning August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express started rolling. At its peak, the operation employed nearly 6,000 vehicles, predominantly GMC Jimmys and Dodge trucks, carrying approximately 12,500 tons of supplies daily. The convoys stretched across dedicated one-way routes from the Normandy beaches to forward supply depots near the front lines. The men who drove these trucks represented a remarkable chapter in American military history. Nearly 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were African American servicemen. The segregated United States Army had relegated black soldiers primarily to service and supply roles, operating under racist assumptions that they lacked capability for combat assignments. Instead, these men proved indispensable to Allied victory. They drove through the night under blackout conditions, often exceeding 60 miles per hour on unfamiliar roads. They pushed through enemy territory, sometimes requiring armored escorts when passing through German pockets. They worked with minimal rest for 83 consecutive days. General Patton himself declared that the 2.5-ton truck was the most valuable weapon in the Allied arsenal. Colonel John Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander's son, argued that without the Red Ball truck drivers, the advance across France could not have been made. An armored division commander credited the black drivers with delivering fuel under constant fire, stating that he would not want their job and that they had what it takes. A 5th Armored Division tank driver said that if it was not for the Red Ball, they could not have moved, adding that they would be in their tanks, praying for the trucks to come up. By the time the Red Ball Express officially terminated on November 16, 1944, the truck companies had moved over 412,000 tons of gasoline, ammunition, food, and other essential supplies. New express routes with different designations continued the work as the Allies pushed into Germany. Throughout these operations, the GMC Jimmy proved remarkably reliable despite brutal operating conditions. If you are finding this exploration of post-war military equipment interesting, consider subscribing for more detailed examinations of forgotten historical episodes. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, American military planners faced an unprecedented challenge. Hundreds of thousands of trucks sat scattered across Europe and the Pacific. The United States had no desire to ship most of this equipment home. Shipping costs alone made return economically unfeasible. The trucks had accumulated wear from years of hard service. Many required extensive overhaul, and American factories stood ready to produce newer civilian vehicles for pent-up consumer demand. The solution came through massive surplus sales that would reshape economies on multiple continents. The federal government established surplus disposal agencies to catalog and sell equipment no longer needed by the military. For trucks like the GMC CCKW, this created an enormous flood of vehicles entering civilian and foreign military markets simultaneously. Within months of the war's end, hundreds of thousands of trucks became available through various surplus channels. American farmers proved among the most eager buyers. By 1945, civilian trucks across rural America had worn out completely. The Great Depression had prevented replacement purchases throughout the 1930s. Wartime restrictions then eliminated new truck production entirely for civilian markets. Agricultural operations desperately needed reliable hauling capacity. The surplus GMC trucks offered exactly what farmers required at prices far below new vehicle costs. However, individual buyers faced significant obstacles. The government typically sold surplus vehicles in large lots rather than individual units. A farmer needing 1 or 2 trucks might find himself required to purchase a dozen or more. Large surplus dealers from eastern cities bought most of these lots, then resold individual vehicles at marked-up prices. Some enterprising farmers pooled resources, purchasing lots collectively and dividing vehicles among participants. Regulations required buyers to obliterate all military markings before operating surplus vehicles on public roads. White stars, hood registration numbers, and unit designations had to disappear. Since paperwork from original government sales would not follow vehicles through subsequent transactions, removing military markings provided the only proof that a truck had been legitimately purchased rather than stolen. Owners used whatever paint they could find to cover military symbols. Industrial yellow became the most common repaint color. The olive drab that had defined these trucks during wartime gradually disappeared from American roads. The GMC Jimmies proved remarkably adaptable to civilian use. Their rugged construction handled agricultural loads with ease. The 6-wheel drive configurations that had pulled supply trailers through European mud now dragged harvesting equipment across American fields. The same reliability that kept the Red Ball Express rolling now served logging operations in the Pacific Northwest and construction projects across growing suburbs. Mechanics appreciated the straightforward engineering that made repairs possible without specialized tools or training. While American farmers absorbed thousands of surplus GMC trucks domestically, an even larger number found their way into foreign military service. The emerging Cold War created immediate demand for military equipment among Western European nations. Countries devastated by 6 years of war lacked industrial capacity to manufacture their own military vehicles. American surplus trucks offered an immediate solution at minimal cost. The GMC CCKW became one of the most common non-Soviet military trucks in the world during the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s. France received enormous quantities of American trucks during and after liberation. These vehicles equipped French military forces throughout the post-war period and during France's colonial conflicts in Indochina and Algeria. French Army units operated GMC trucks well into the 1960s, with some vehicles serving even longer in reserve roles. Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, and other NATO allies similarly absorbed surplus American trucks into their rebuilding military forces. A Belgian mechanic trained on the GMC platform could repair a Danish truck using French-supplied parts. This interoperability became a cornerstone of NATO logistics planning. Meanwhile, the GMC CCKW did not disappear from American military service. The United States Army retained substantial numbers of these trucks through the late 1940s and into the Korean War. When North Korean forces invaded South Korea in June 1950, the United States military found itself fighting another major conflict just 5 years after World War II ended. The GMC trucks that had supplied Patton's race across France now supported American forces defending the Pusan perimeter and advancing northward after the Incheon landing. Korean War service proved that the CCKW remained a capable military vehicle even as newer designs entered production. The rugged terrain and poor road infrastructure of the Korean peninsula challenged logistics operations much as the hedgerows of Normandy had challenged drivers years earlier. American soldiers who had learned to drive on post-war surplus trucks found themselves operating the same vehicles under combat conditions. However, military planners recognized that the CCKW design was approaching obsolescence. In the late 1940s, the Army initiated a competition for a new standard 2.5-ton truck. REO's proposal, which became the M35 series, won standardization for all services in 1950. The transition from CCKW to M35 occurred gradually throughout the 50s. By the mid-1960s, the CCKW had largely disappeared from active American units, though National Guard forces continued operating some trucks for additional years. The fate of GMC trucks disposed through surplus channels varied enormously. Vehicles purchased by farmers often worked until mechanical failure made repair uneconomical, then sat in fields and barns awaiting disposal. The harsh American climate accelerated deterioration of neglected trucks. Exposed metal corroded, tires perished, canvas tops rotted. Within a decade of surplus sale, many trucks had deteriorated beyond economical restoration. Spare parts availability presented particular challenges. The military had supplied enormous quantities of replacement components during wartime, but these supply chains closed when the war ended. American manufacturers focused on civilian products rather than maintaining parts production for military designs. As vehicles broke down, they frequently became parts sources for keeping other trucks operational. By the early 1960s, intact GMC CCKWs had become uncommon outside military installations and specialized collections. European survivors followed different trajectories. NATO military forces generally maintained their American trucks more carefully than civilian surplus buyers. Military maintenance protocols, established spare parts, supplies, and institutional knowledge preserved these vehicles in operational condition for decades. Some European armies operated GMC trucks into the 1990s, an astonishing service life of 50 years for designs created before American entry into World War II. When European militaries finally retired their GMC fleets, many trucks entered the collector market rather than being scrapped. Military vehicle enthusiasts recognized these European survivors as remarkably complete and well-preserved examples of historic vehicles. Trucks that had served in the Danish, Belgian, or French armies often retained original components long since unavailable for American civilian survivors. The collector market began importing these vehicles back to the United States. The historical memory of the GMC CCKW evolved significantly over the decades following World War II. During the immediate post-war years, these trucks represented practical transportation rather than historical artifacts. Surplus buyers valued them for utility, not heritage. The men who had driven them during the war generally preferred to forget military service rather than celebrate it. The Red Ball Express and its predominantly African-American drivers faced particular historical neglect. The segregated military that had relegated black soldiers to service roles also marginalized their contributions in official histories and public memory. A 1952 Hollywood film titled Red Ball Express acknowledged the supply operation but failed to accurately represent its participants' demographics. Changing attitudes toward World War II history gradually elevated appreciation for logistics. Military historians began emphasizing that modern mechanized warfare depended as much on supply chains as on combat arms. The GMC CCKW emerged as a symbol of American industrial might and logistical excellence. Civil rights consciousness also prompted reassessment of African American contributions. The Red Ball Express became recognized as a significant chapter in black military history, demonstrating capability despite institutional racism. Today, surviving GMC CCKW trucks occupy honored places in military vehicle collections and museums worldwide. Dedicated enthusiasts have spent decades locating, restoring, and preserving these historic trucks. Organizations devoted specifically to the CCKW maintain technical knowledge, share restoration expertise, and coordinate parts sourcing among members. Restored trucks appear at military vehicle shows, historical reenactments, and commemorative events. D-Day anniversary celebrations in Normandy include convoys of restored American trucks tracing routes their predecessors drove 80 years ago. Museum collections preserve representative examples of CCKW variants that few civilians ever encountered during wartime. Private collectors maintain running examples that demonstrate capabilities impossible to appreciate in static displays. The legacy extends beyond surviving hardware into questions of industrial capacity, logistics planning, and historical memory. These trucks demonstrated that American manufacturing could overwhelm enemies through sheer productive output. German forces, still dependent on horses for much of their logistics, faced opponents whose trucks outnumbered their entire vehicle fleet many times over. The story that began in August 1945 with hundreds of thousands of American-built trucks scattered across Europe concluded with systematic distribution driven by Cold War necessity and economic pragmatism. Most trucks were neither returned home nor preserved as artifacts, but rather absorbed into civilian economies and foreign military forces before wearing out through hard use or rusting away through neglect. What survives today represents perhaps a few thousand trucks from the original 500,000. These precious survivors serve as tangible evidence of the logistical miracle that sustained Allied armies and the industrial might that made American victory possible. For the African American soldiers who drove these trucks through the night, under fire, without recognition, the surviving vehicles represent monuments to contributions that official history long minimized. They are reminders that victory required not just those who pulled triggers, but those who delivered the ammunition. If you found this video insightful, hit that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Thanks for watching.